This lecture is anchored in the book Modern Hospice Design, The Architecture of Palliative and Social Care by Ken Warpole, who's a English writer and who's very interested in public architecture. So I'm going to be basing it in that and highlighting hospice. He's concerned with a broader range of buildings that have to do with public health care, and I think it's important to talk a bit about that, but I do, of course, want to focus on hospice and palliative care design. So in the first part of the book, which was just recently updated, and this is obviously because the field is burgeoning and it's more important than ever to have these discussions before shovels go into the ground. And so he talks about obviously the overarching context of the fact that in most of the Western world we have aging populations, so this is coming at us very fast. And so he talks about the fact that design brings together social reformers, philosophers, architects. And so this is also true of palliative and hospice care itself, this idea that we need all these players to be participating. It can't just be one group of people making decisions. So he talks about the way that social relations are structured by buildings and built environments. And so again, as I said in the earlier lecture on therapeutic environments, this is something we don't necessarily think about. We just move into these spaces and we're impacted on a kind of subliminal level by them, or annoyed by them, or whatever our reaction is. But this idea that actually buildings structure how we socialize, they structure how we relate to one another. And so it becomes very important. And he talks about the fact, now the British case is obviously different. Their healthcare system it's universal healthcare, but it's done differently than ours. So, but he talks about the idea of the players in social care being the private sector, charitable foundations, the government, and so on. And so he starts out in this work talking about the duty of care. And so when we use that kind of language, and obviously we've been using it throughout the course, we're talking about moral imperatives then at that point. And so clearly this comes from a certain philosophical or religious view of the world, that we have the duty to care. It's not something we can take or leave. And so he calls it the architecture of care, which I find a really effective turn of phrase, the architecture of care. So what would that look like? If you work in healthcare, you think of it in how it operates in your relationships with patients. And if you're an architect, what an interesting idea that you would think about the architecture of care and how you facilitate that happening. And so he recognizes that this first begins in Europe, as we've already talked about in this course, in the medieval monastery hospices. So emerging out of that larger ethic of public care institutions, which include asylums, hospital, almshouses, etc. And so he makes clear that this, again, is based in the idea, he uses the word care, which comes from caritas, which has the idea of sharing sorrow, sharing suffering, a concern for the suffering of others, and a wish to alleviate suffering. So that's really in a nutshell, and we talked about that at the very beginning of the course, a concern for the suffering of others and a wish to alleviate that suffering. So this is a care ethos, which then he's talking about how this can be embodied in a structure. And so so he makes an important note that we've also talked earlier in the course about, that as soon as we talk about care ethics, we never seem to shake off an entanglement with the female, the feminine element. And so he uses this to bridge into talking about the fact that up until very recently, most architects were men. And this is a whole other topic, but it's something that I have noticed, whether it's men or women, there's often a kind of strange egotism in architecture of wanting to make this spectacular building that, will become known around the world, rather than any concern about, does it fit in with the landscape it's in? Does it actually serve the function it's supposed to serve for the community? And so he's saying we need to have women in architecture to bring, well, he seems to be saying it to me, and that's not to say men can't do it either. Many hospice architects are male, but certainly we have to take in that care ethic, whether it's a man or a woman, in the way the space is built. And it's also recognizing that only people that our functioning within those spaces can really speak to it. So he talks a lot about the idea of community consultation and consultation with all the stakeholders so that we hear from everybody that's going to be using the space and how that will work most effectively for them. So it can't just be the architect's vision. That does not fit when we're looking at care architecture. And so he then talks about the idea of the sense of home. And so we use this in our language of care homes, but we also know that they don't really function in that way. Certainly most people don't feel very at home in those spaces. We know that most people want to stay at home if they can, as long as possible, certainly. And so he notes that we've come full circle from people being taken care of and at end-of-life care in the home to the hospital, to the hospice, and now we're seeing a push back into the home. And so I think it's important to note, as he does, these are hybrid spaces, and so the more flexible they can be, the better, because we're seeing this process of, if we have more in-home care for end of life, then we need the hospice to function in a certain way, perhaps as the place that organizes that, but also providing respite care, which they already do. So this is kind of happening on the ground anyway, but we can build it for that, so it reflects that need for flexibility. And so he talks about the idea of balancing the need for the familiar, the home-like, and then the needs of the care. And so we've talked about that in the earlier lecture. He also makes a really important point that this can't be formulaic. We shouldn't just be having these templates of hospices and plonking them down in different places in the world. And this is something that I discussed a little bit in the idea of the difference between St. Christopher's and Nipissing Serenity Hospice, and I'll be talking about that in more detail next week. The way they reflect their cultures, the way they reflect their locations is very important. So he makes a really, I think, vital intervention here. A home for the dying is not the place for avant-garde experimentation. Absolutely. It's very off-putting. And as with a lot of this kind of, whether it's in the art world or not, I often wonder who it's for. Because the building has to work for the people in it. It's not about the architect making a splash, for instance, or furthering their career. So I have noticed in architects that work in this field that I've come across that they have a very, very different approach. They're a bit like the architectural equivalent of palliative care nurses and doctors and social workers, that they take a very different approach, kind of service approach to what they're doing. So we know, for instance, that there are different factors coming in, and we're sort of responding to them. So the idea of not sequestering people. So there was a kind of a logic of moving people away, and some of that was meant to get them away from stress. But what we're finding, certainly in Denmark, they've been pioneering this idea of not sequestering older people and keeping them in the flow of life. So I think that's very important to take on board. And certainly with the early days of Cicely Saunders and St. Christopher's, as I mentioned, people were going to the movies, they were going to the pub from the hospice. So it wasn't like you were meant to just stay there and be isolated. And so he talks about all these different forms of social care that have occurred in Western society. And he talks about almshouses, which I have mentioned. And this was something that was new to me. And I realized we do have it in Canada. We just don't call it that. That's certainly there are many, many different kind of buildings that cater to the elderly that are run through churches and church organizations. I know there's one in North Bay out of St. John's Anglican Church. So they do exist, we just don't call them by that name. So there are many different forms of this kind of social care and public housing, and the more streamlined it can be in conversation with one another, certainly the better. And it's also the idea that we take advantage of what already exists and we bring it into the larger system, but then we also are building these newer facilities. In one of the first chapters of the book, called A House at the End of Life, Warpole gives a kind of overview of what he calls life and death on the public ward. And so we've talked about this already in terms of sort of part of the development of nursing. And so that the needs of a ward, for instance, are different than what we see at end-of-life care. But certainly, I'm just giving this very spooky picture of former insane asylum. And so we can see that there's been a real rethinking of what these public spaces are going to look like. Really, these older forms of buildings have become a place of horror in the public imaginary. And when I went looking for images, a lot of them were like horrific images or like from horror movies. And so it's pretty telling that these spaces have become kind of inspirations for horror movies. I think that's a bad sign when your built environment is doing that. And if we take away some of this dark and gloomy lighting, the building itself is not terrible, but it's not inviting. It's very, you can imagine driving up to this. This is not something you're going to be looking forward to. So we've really seen in the contemporary era revisiting all of this in sectors of public care. So he talks about the larger issue, which we have discussed already in this course, about the fact that so many people die in institutional care now, and that pretty much there's a consensus that this isn't the way it should be. And so he goes on to say that in England and Wales, as of 2018, 47% of deaths occurred in the hospitals, and it's higher in North America. And so the interest in hospice and palliative care and in-home palliative care is based at least partly on this. And so he talks about the idea that, I think this is also important, that he quotes a professor of hospice studies at Lancaster University who said, dying at home is very scary. You might think you want to do it, and you might want to support someone in your family who says they want to do it, but in the midst of it actually happening, you may feel you'd be better off elsewhere. So I think that's also important to look at, that we might think in our head intellectually this is a good thing, but we may be overwhelmed by the needs of that person. And so again, the institutional hospice and palliative care becomes a very important part of all of this. So we also find a larger concern around the care of the elderly in countries like Canada, the United States, and England, and the way that they get sequestered. And this is all, of course, a piece with that larger death-denying society. So this is a cultural problem. It's not just a public health problem. It's both. But generally, we're seeing that people are beginning to question this. And so Worpool is actually talking very little bit about medical or technical treatment in this book. He's talking much more from a kind of personal angle. And so he quotes the novelist Julian Barnes describing his father's death. He died in a modern death in a hospital without his family, attended in his final minutes by a nurse, months, indeed years after medical science had prolonged his life to a point where the terms on which it was being offered were unimpressive. So there's a lot of points being made in that. And then I found this very upsetting, actually. So writer Alan Bennett describing the aftermath of his father's death in hospital. He died on the Saturday morning when I was already on the train north. So when I saw his body on the Monday at Airedale Hospital, he had been dead 2 days. The mortuary was somewhere in the back of the hospital, not a facility I suppose they wanted to make a show of. It was near the boiler room and the back doors of the kitchen. I was put in a curtained room called the viewing room, where Dad lay under a terrible purple pall. There were 2 attendants, one of whom pulled back the shroud. It was a shocking sight. I'll just skip over part of this. It was the first time in his life, except it wasn't in his life, that he can have looked fierce. I noticed that the attendants were looking at me, more interested in my reaction than in the corpse, which to them must have seemed commonplace. And so we're going to see this when we look at the story of Mathilde Gravel, the founder of the local hospice in North Bay, that these experiences that were so negative with death have really been one of the great kind of drivers of this larger movement towards hospice and palliative care. And so, so he goes on, quoting a Dutch architectural historian who says, hospitals are also built catastrophes, anonymous institutional complexes run by vast bureaucracies and totally unfit for the purpose they have been designed for. They are hardly ever functional, and instead of making patients feel at home, they produce stress and anxiety. So this is something that we have been talking about in this section. So a lot of this movement of taking architecture of public spaces, and particularly public care spaces, seriously is coming out of this larger, I would say, international consensus. So Warpole ends this chapter by saying that the hospice movement nationally, internationally, has been very good at sharing best practices. And this is something I do want to talk about at the end of the course, the way that hospice and palliative care in many ways has been a vanguard, whether we're looking at the concept of total pain and the idea of the dimensions of suffering, different ideas of the human person, different ideas about hierarchy. So hospice from its very beginning, as we saw, was very clear that, and palliative care of always sharing openly everything that they had discovered worked well. So we really see that this is quite a radical revolutionary change that's happening in the larger movement of public care. The image here is of a Japanese hospice that won an international award for design, and you can see just by looking at a number of images, I already noticed that they're almost always these kind of low slung buildings. You don't see that, 3-4 stories like you saw in those earlier forms. Of course, a lot of that is practical. It's easier to move people around when it's all on one level. So that is definitely one of the sort of architectural hallmarks of hospice that I've seen anyway. But you can see with this example that it's very much drawing on Japanese Buddhist Shinto ideas about being in nature that are increasingly impacting all of hospice design. But I do think it's important to note that hospices will look different, obviously, in different countries because they're partaking of the culture of those countries. And this becomes another important way to address that issue that I brought up in an earlier lecture about we don't want to be part of medical imperialism, of trying to impose a model on cultures that doesn't fit. So architecture is a part of that. Another thing that Warpole brings up is that hospitals and hospices can learn from hotels. And this was a bit shocking when I first read it, and then when I thought about it, it makes complete sense because as we talked about at the very beginning of this course, the root word hospice is the same as hotel, it's the same as hospitality. And so when we're talking about lived spaces that are welcoming and home-like, hotels are very good at that, especially upper kind of echelon hotels are absolutely amazing at this. So it's not that we necessarily feel that we're at home, but we feel comfortable, and even they're often very beautiful. I've often said staying in a really nice hotel is like medicine in and of itself. So I found it interesting that that he takes this on board. And so he talks about a hospice that has said that the people that go there are honored guests. And so that tradition that we see in many, many traditional cultures of the guest as a kind of sacred thing of taking care of a guest. And also he calls it the ritualized status of the guest. So maybe this is something, again, we need to bring into how we're understanding the care and how we're understanding the space. And so he talks about the social benefits of hotel-style accommodation. And so he gives the example of St. Olav's Hospital in Norway, which has a patient hotel with 110 rooms, and some of them are for let, just as a business, and some are for families. And so this becomes another aspect of hospice building. And this works better in the Canadian case anyway when it's in a hospital complex, because my experience with hospices in Canada have been that if it's a small community hospice, they simply can't afford to do this. They can't afford to create an area to house the families, but certainly hospitals can often do it. And so this idea of also thinking of the stress on the family if they've had to come from a distance and then they're staying in a hotel, is there a way we can also be thinking about that when we're creating these designs? And so he talks about the idea of the physical, emotional, social, and spiritual care that can be embodied within a building and an institution. And so it's very interesting to me. You can see this almost maps onto the idea of total pain, that the building itself would take into account all these dimensions of a human being. So he goes on to say that A strength of many hospices is that staff tend to stay working there for a very long time, in the process becoming deeply committed to the ethos of their building, fellow staff, and customary routines. And that has to be a good sign if we're seeing that people who work in palliative care tend to stay, because you would think logically that in such a challenging environment, you'd see a lot of staff turnover. So that is certainly, we know this anywhere. If you see that staff stays, you know that it's a good environment. And so he goes on to say, rather than being depleted emotionally by the constant presence of death amongst their patients, nursing staff seem to be strengthened by the relationships they create and foster. As so often, it was noticeable that by far the majority of nursing staffs in hospital and hospices visited in Ireland, Norway, and Sweden are women, and the degree of domestication in the design of the interiors often reflects this. So again, all these concepts kind of coming together here, and the idea that the space, a number of the hospices also have kind of bistros and restaurants that are open to the public, so creating this much more welcoming environment is good, obviously, for the patients, which is the #1 concern, but also very good for the well-being of the staff and of the people who are visiting. I want to end off this section by talking about sacred space within the hospice itself. And this is a topic that I've been looking for material on, and there's almost nothing, and I think that's very telling, and it's something that I am very interested in. And this would go for any healthcare setting, long-term care, or hospitals. And so most hospitals that I know of have a room, but I'll be interested to hear from people, but my experience has been that they're a complete afterthought. And certainly within certain experiences I've had, becomes kind of a storage room, or it's just completely an ignored space. And so I was at the Newmarket Hospital about a year ago, and the space was this very strange pod that went up to the top of the building. It was very off-putting space. It's not something I would even consider going into in an attempt to relax or be in a serene setting. Now, there's many, many things working against this. We talked already in the terms of the dimensions of total pain. Spiritual dimension often gets shunted aside. So it makes sense that that would happen also in terms of architecture and built space, because this is a cultural issue. So we've got a number of different things that are causing this, I think. One of them, obviously, is the increasing secularism of our society. We know that it's probably around 30% of people are not affiliated with, according to the census, any kind of religious tradition. So there's that, and that has definitely been my experience, that when you talk to administrators, they're kind of religiously tone deaf. And so they may kind of nod and say, yes, the spiritual, but then it becomes an afterthought. So if you don't put money and time and effort into it, it's not important, in my opinion. So, and that's what we usually see. And so I think this, for me, I think this is very important. And the idea that, for instance, I'll just give you the example of St. Christopher's. When I went to visit there a few years ago, I met with the chaplain, the in-house chaplain, and he took me to the sacred area. And I was in shock, because Dame Cicely Saunders, actually, that was the most important thing for her. And so she had a chapel built. So I was looking forward to seeing that, this beautiful space, and it had been completely removed. And his argument was that it had to be a multicultural space. So this is the other challenge. Obviously, Saunders was Christian, and that was the impetus for what she was doing, but we live in a multicultural society. So how do we then allow for sacred space that's multicultural? So the space that we sat in and that he showed me was almost completely bare. It had a few kind of graphics of rainbows and some books. But again, it seemed very much like an afterthought and a kind of stark environment. It wasn't welcoming at all, in my opinion. And I think this can also be part of the problem when people say we're going to make it multicultural. It just becomes a way of saying we're not going to do anything. We're just going to be empty. And I don't think that's the answer either. So I'll be interested in, it'll be our discussion question if you have opinions about this from your experience, because these spaces can also be used by staff as a place to kind of retreat to go to if they're having a hard day, or if they just want to contemplate or meditate or pray. And so this is potentially a very important asset for these public healthcare spaces. So the image I'm showing you here is of the sacred space in a Boston hospice, and I'll be interested to know your opinion. I'm not loving it. I think it looks very bureaucratic and kind of empty. So my idea would be that if we're going to say we're taking this seriously, then we have to approach the sacred space just as we do the rest of the building and build it with purpose and intent. And so, and again, I think that idea of the hotel is a very good example, using the principles that they use. There's a number of online decor people that that I watched that I think, why don't they just get some of these people in to make it a more home-like space? Now, of course, it's public, and so it can't be completely home-like. We know that already, but certainly there are ways of making this more inviting. Because sometimes there are actual services done in these spaces, and I find this just so anonymous and so kind of cold. And so I think this is a kind of lost dimension of hospices in my experience, and certainly it's coming from a variety of issues that are kind of being worked out within the space, but what tends to happen is it just gets ignored. And so I think this is definitely an area that could use some work, both by people in architecture, by people in religious studies, looking at how we can make these spaces multicultural, but also welcoming. And even the person doesn't have to be religious or spiritual. They just may want a place where they'll feel that they can relax and retreat in the midst of what can be a very challenging time, which is sort of the point of having these spaces, rather than they become kind of a glorified store cupboard. And so again, as we've been talking about throughout the course, this is a cultural issue of the ways in which religion and spirituality have been kind of pushed to the sideline. There's a lot of discomfort around religion in public spaces, and so it's being expressed in this way. And so I think there's a lot of room for improvement. And so I'll be very interested to hear your experiences if you've, in hospitals and hospice and long-term care, if you've had a better experience, or if you know best practices and you have an image, please send it along and I'll post it for everybody. I just have not, in my travels in hospice or in hospitals, come across this. So I think this is really, we can open up a conversation about it.